Thank you all for joining. May you and yours be safe. We welcome you today to our series. We're part of a community of compassion. As Sarah said, we have more than 300 on the call. We at the Nation are working to expose how the pandemic has revealed pre-existing injustices and cruelty of our health, economic, social systems, savaging communities of color, communities of the poor, while we also serve as a frontline for bold ideas needed to rebuild a more just, equitable, fair, peaceful country in the world. We are deeply honored to have Reverend William Barber with us today. In the past few years, as so many of you know, Reverend Barber has become an indispensable figure in the civil rights landscape, the racial justice landscape, the architect of a broad-based political and moral movement countering the divisiveness of Trumpism. I had the good fortune to be at Riverside Church in April 2017 when Reverend Barber delivered an extraordinary sermon, When Silence is Not an Option. It was 50 years to the day Reverend Martin Luther King delivered his 1967 speech against the Vietnam War, calling for a radical revolution of values, an opposition to the intertwined evils, which Reverend Barber speaks out about today: racism, extreme materialism, militarism. Reverend Barber adds catastrophic climate crisis. Many of you on this call may remember the ferocious, fierce disapproval King confronted. His allies in the civil rights movement and the liberal community attacked him. 150 newspapers denounced him. The New York Times rebuked King, arguing, quote, to divert the energies of the civil rights movement to the Vietnam issue is both wasteful and self-defeating. The Nation, instead, wrote that King, who had been the magazine's civil rights correspondent from 1961 to 67, his, quote, Riverside Church speech will rank as one of the most significant of his career, laced with eloquence and morally uncompromising. Why do I say this? Because Reverend Barber, who is very much his own person, but like King, understands that the prophetic role of the preacher or religious leader is to challenge the soul and the heart of the nation. Reverend Barber understands that the moral and constitutional crisis we confront in America is not just about Republicans versus Democrats or liberals versus conservative. We're in a struggle for the heart and soul of this nation. For half a century, political operatives who paved the way for Trumpism have used Nixon's Southern strategy to pit Black, brown, and white people against each other. They've hijacked our moral narrative to frame narrow cultural differences as the only moral issues in public life. Reverend Barber's work has refused to allow today's know-nothings to hijack America's narrative. He has done so wearing many hats, cloths, duties. Pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina since 1993. As the founder of Moral Mondays, an extraordinary fusion coalition first organized in 2013 to protest the right-wing agenda of North Carolina's state legislature. Largely credited with salvaging voting rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, healthcare rights in that state. He's president of Repairers of the Breach, which seeks to reclaim the idea of morality for progressive activism, and co-chair of the relaunched Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, King's last and most radical campaign. And this campaign is engaged in widespread acts of massive, nonviolent moral civil disobedience. There will be a digital march on June 20th, which I know the Reverend will talk about. It has stood for economic justice, challenged poverty, systemic racism, the racializing of voter suppression, the cruelty of our immigration system, and our impoverished democracy. Reverend Barber is a key architect of the Third Reconstruction, a book, in fact, he wrote about Third Reconstruction. And he files scores of dispatches from the front lines of the racial justice movement, many for the Nation, where we are proud he's our civil rights correspondent. In 2015, the Reverend received the Puffin Nation Prize for Creator Citizenship, and that same year he was a speaker at the nation's 150th anniversary celebration with Senator Elizabeth Warren. I cannot think of anyone I would rather hear from at this time than Reverend Barber. So we're very, very grateful to you, Reverend Barber, for taking time. On the call before people got on, you spoke about what you are dealing with in your community, with your extended family, your family. So again, we're so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And let me thank you for the historic and powerful liberation legacy of the Nation magazine. I'm just humbled every time I think about having the opportunity to be a part of this family. I decided this morning not to wear my per se clergy attire, but to wear this shirt that says "We Rise Together," June 20th, 2020, for the mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington, digital and mobile, that we had been planning to engage physically this June 20th. And there were some that had said, call it off. But then people from the front line said, no, we need to gather more now than ever before. Right in the midst of this pandemic, we need to have the largest gathering online of poor, low wealth people, moral leaders, media, and people who are determined not to let this nation in the midst of this pandemic once again walk by the poor and the low income of this nation. My speech may be somewhat slow this morning because I'm in a lot of emotional pain right now. And I'm being very honest with you, as I know many of your audience are. I've been living with the scripture overnight that I want to read to you. And it causes me to tremble for America right now, the world, but America. And it says in Ezekiel 22, this is what the sovereign Lord says. The people of the land practice extortion and commit robbery. They oppress the poor and the needy and mistreat the stranger. And they deny all of them justice. Verse 30 says, I, the Lord, look for someone among them who would stand in the gap on behalf of the people of the land. So I would not have to destroy it, but I could find nobody to stand in the gap for those who were facing injustice. When I think about this pandemic in the midst of poverty, we have to deal with this reality that there was a pandemic of greed, a pandemic of distortion and political divisions before this pandemic ever existed as a biological reality. Before this pandemic hit, there were 700 people a day dying from poverty and low income, which means we're wrong when we say that we're having the highest number of people dying right now. We're having another 700 or 800 on top of the 700 that were already dying per day from poverty and low income, according to studies by groups like the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Policy. Prior to this pandemic, we had 140 million people living in poverty, 43% of this nation, 26 million African Americans, 66 million people who are Caucasian. But the 26 million African Americans represented over 61% or 61% of all African Americans. Child poverty in this nation prior to the pandemic was at grotesque levels for a country that claims the amount of wealth that we have. We had 30-some million people without health care, 80-some million people who are underinsured, 62 million people working every day without a living wage, many of them without sick care, without unemployment. And one of the things that we also faced was 4 million families who every day can buy unleaded gas, can't buy unleaded water before the pandemic. Gross amounts of people who could not find shelter. They have to work at least no county in this country, a person could work a minimum wage job and afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment before the biological pandemic. And we've been talking to some scholars, some public health advocates. My daughter's a PhD in public health from Harvard. Actually, we've been working with Mary Bassett, who's at Harvard, a public health specialist, and Sister Ford, Dr. Ford from UCLA. And Katrina, they said to us something right off the bat that has not been really discussed in this nation. They said pandemics have a biological and a sociological reality. That pandemics spread through the fissures of our society caused by inequality. That pandemics exploit the open wounds of a society caused by racism and the criminalization of poverty. That you cannot ultimately deal with a pandemic as long as those inequalities are open and those wounds are not cared for. That the wounds will extend the life and the reach and the depth of the pandemic. That you might even be able to flatten the line, but a flat line does not mean the poorest among you will still not be suffering. And if the poorest among you are suffering, you will continue to have the pandemic alive and well for the rest of us in any society, because pandemics exploit those inequalities. And so what this pandemic has been for this nation in some ways is kind of like the dye that they put inside your body when you're going to get an x-ray. The dye makes you see more clearly what was already existing. That if we had closed some of these gaps, we've been crying out about them for over 3 years now. If we had closed some of these gaps in healthcare and homelessness and the inability for people to afford water and living wages and healthcare, if we had closed the gaps prior to the pandemic would not be so horrific. But because the gaps are there, the pandemic is so horrific. So the pandemic hits, and we see the exploitation. And what hurts so much, why I told you earlier I'm in this mood this morning, is because we've had 4 bills passed. And all of them have been done from the perspective of the wealthy, from the perspective of corporations, from the perspective of business. We passed 4 bills a month or so ago. In this nation, some forces were saying, we don't have the money. We can't do certain things. But then all of a sudden, in the middle of the pandemic, before we even had the high levels of death that we knew were coming, we found $2.5 trillion for business, corporations, and probably now another almost $500 billion, which would mean somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 trillion. And we passed a bill that is considered CARES. Now, I'm not unmindful that some people have fought. I'm not unmindful that some Democrats have fought against over these odds with Trump and McConnell, but still, even some of our Democratic friends have not done some of the things that they should do, have not gone to the mat, as we used to say in wrestling, on some of these issues. And so we end up passing a bill. The bill does not guarantee health care. The bill does not guarantee living wages. The bill says you can get free testing, but you won't get free health care if you are found infected. The bill does not guarantee rent forgiveness. It only says that your rent is forgiven for 3 months, but in the 4th month, or 4 or 3 months will be owed. The bill does not guarantee that utilities can't be shut off, even water, when one thing you need in this crisis is the ability to wash your hands. The bill says we're going to ignore 11 million undocumented workers. We're going to talk about 500,000 homeless people, but not the millions who are either homeless or on the verge of homelessness. And we're going to call people essential workers, and we're going to say that they are the soul of America. And the question I've been raised is, when are they going to see the soul of America? Or have they? Because as Fannie Lou Hamer says, if this is the soul of America, then I question America. If this is America, that you can give nearly $3 trillion to corporations and treat corporations like people and people like things. That with all this death, everyday death, if we can't guarantee health care now, if we can't guarantee protections now, then that says a whole lot about those in leadership, and it speaks to why we have to have a movement of the people. Many of the people that I'm around, we've been wrestling with this question in the movement. If you knew you only had 48 hours of breath left, what kind of world would you use your last breath to fight for? What kind of justice, what kind of love, what kind of mercy, what kind of health care, what kind of living wage? Well, that's the moment many people are saying we're in. The only way we can honor those who have died is to use every breath we have from this point to fight for the kind of world we know must be possible. Otherwise, we don't have a world. We have a war between the haves and the have-nots. And it's a constant war. And so early on, the Poor People's Campaign, we actually put together an agenda. Your audience can go to moveon.org/poverty. And we have over nearly 100,000 people that have already signed on to this. And we said, if this nation is serious, and I'm writing today on behalf of the campaign, Pelosi and Schumer and all of them, and saying, wait a minute now, 4 bills, and we've not had a major fight. You know, sometimes, Catherine, what bothers us is not what we don't win, but what we don't fight for. What the leaders go in the back room and they compromise. And I said in a meditation last night, one of the great struggles I have, and this magazine in its founding in some ways raised this question or this concern, and that is that one of the ugly psychosis of America that we continue to see played out in this moment is when too many and powerful are too comfortable with other people's death. That's a psychosis of America, a part of our history that we have to constantly battle against. It's what allowed the genocide of First Nation people. Too many people in power comfortable with other people's death. It's what allowed slavery. It's what allowed lynching. It's what allowed in the turn of the century, the 20th century, industries and not to have certain protections for workers and child labor laws. Too many people in power are too comfortable with other people's death. It's why we went to Vietnam with all of the lies. Too many people in power, too comfortable with other folks' death. And in this moment, when we see these bills that constantly are passed, too many people are too comfortable with other people's dying. And they're not fighting as they should in the public arena. And we have to change that. We said that what we need, if America is serious about this pandemic, if America is serious about dealing with it, we must have immediate, comprehensive, and permanent paid sick leave for 100% of employees. We need immediate health care for all, including 100% free COVID-19 testing and treatment. We need that. We have to have protection for all of our workers. We need a national moratorium on worker and utility shutoffs, a waiver of all late payment charges, restitution of any services that have been cut off due to non-payment. We need expansion of resources and funding for FEMA. We need to end work requirements on all federal benefits, including SNAP, Medicaid, and increased SNAP. We need resources to keep rural hospitals and community health centers open and put field hospitals where many hospitals have been closed in urban and in rural areas. We need permanent protections for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We need to protect people in mental health facilities, prisons, juvenile detention centers. When we talk about essential workers, we need to talk about nurses and doctors and janitors and orderlies and maids. We need to use the power of all of the resources in our military, but not put it in the hands of the military, put it in the hands of public health specialists, public health experts. We must fight for these things. And the fight will not be over April 30th. The fight will not be over in May. Many public health experts tell us that this battle with this pandemic is a long fight. And I believe, as I go back and close to that first scripture, you know, in Ezekiel 22, God said, who can I find that will stand in the gap? And God said, I could find nobody, but if you keep reading 15 chapters over, God found the somebodies to stand in the gap. And guess what? Who they were? The people in the gap, the people in the valley. In the Bible, it's called the Valley of Dry Bones. And it was there that God raised up a movement of people who had nothing else to lose, who said, we're not going to give up on this nation yet. And they rose up and became a mighty instrument of transformation and liberation. And I believe in many ways that is the only hope for this country. Those who are dying, who've seen others die, to begin to stand up and say, if it takes our last breath, we're not going to accept this America. We're not going to accept people being comfortable, too comfortable with other people's deaths. We have to be better than this.
Reverend, thank you for your humane rage and your demands, which are real and we must fight for. Reminding us of what we must fight for is so extraordinarily important. I'm going to turn it over to the questions because I can see so many want to ask you about what you've just spoken of and other fights, issues you've been engaged with. But thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Barber. We have a lot of questions coming to you, and I know you like to answer them, and I think this is going to be extraordinary. We have several people wondering what we could do now. We don't accept this America, and would like to take some action. And Janet DeWart Bell asks, how do we convince white people that racism kills them too?
That's a powerful insight. And I think one of the things that's been a power of the Poor People's Campaign is bringing people together across these false lines of division, but are very real divisions. Remember, it was in 1965, at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, that Martin Luther King said these words that are very often excluded from remembering about him and the movement. He said, anytime, and I paraphrase, there's the possibility for white and black people to come together and change the political power structure of this nation, white and black poor people especially, the Bourbon class sows division. It has always been that way. And he was trying to say, then if that's the case, we must recognize that much of the division we see, much of the pushback we see, many times is a sign of fear by those who know what can happen if we come together. And the question is, do we know it? So what we do in the Poor People's Campaign to help bring people together is we go, number one, to the places where poor whites, poor blacks, and we put people in the same room. And then we teach. And what we do, the first maps that we put up and we show people, we call them the Open Your Eyes maps. It's a map that shows first racialized voter suppression. We show where all the racialized voter suppression is. The next map we put up is child poverty. Then the next map is poverty. The next map is women in poverty. The next map is the states without health care, the states without living wages, the states that have the worst laws against LGBTQ people and immigrants, and the states that have the worst laws to regulate corporations polluting our environment. And then we step back and we say, look at that map. And people say, wait a minute, let's flip back to the beginning. Look at the voting rights, the racist voter suppression maps, look at all the other, and they say, but it's the same states. And we say, that's the point. When we teach people, particularly using something as tangible as racist voter suppression, that the same persons that use racialized voter suppression to get elected, to rig elections, once they do that, they pass laws that hurt mostly white people. Now, I didn't say mostly white people in terms of percentage. And I recognize that poverty among black people has a whole different reality because of racism. But people have to understand, as my grandmama used to say, if you scratch a racist and scratch a liar, you find a thief. If you scratch a racist, normally you find an anti-healthcare person and an anti-public education person and an anti-LGBTQ person. And so we have to show people in tangible, empirical ways that they're being played against one another. But that's not enough. Next, then, we have to show them that if they came together, what power they had. So we're about to release a study that shows what would happen if just 5 to 10% of black and white people around an agenda that addresses systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism would come together. Not 50%, not 60%, if just 5 to 10% of them would come together and build a voting bloc, they could have fundamental transformational power even in southern states. I'm convinced that one of the reasons we see such an ugly rise of Trumpism and Trump evangelicals and McConnell stacking the court is not power, but fear. Fear, because they know that we're right in this moment that we can come together. And that's why we're calling on people to join the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Join us on June the 20th when we show America, not me speaking, but we're going to put coal miners from Kentucky on the digital stage with Black folk from the Delta, who are going to say to America, it's time for us, this unlikely coalition, this counterintuitive coalition, to come together and build power and change the narrative. I believe that's the only hope we have in this nation.
Gary Spencer wonders how church social action committees might be able to help. What could they do?
We need every church social action committee. And let me just first of all say, Gary, I'm glad you have a church social action committee. You know, it's all right to have a church fellowship committee. It's all right to have a church cookie baking committee and all those things. But we need church social action because the church ought to be about social action. We need every one of them to go to our website on poorpeoplescampaign.org or www.breachrepairs.org and to sign up. We need thousands upon thousands of people to join this digital march, this digital assembly that's not going to be an end. Actually, one of the things we're going to do in June 20 is talk about the 5 things we need to do this year to reshape the political landscape and show people the power that we have to do that, and why we have to have a nonpartisan movement that is nonpartisan but very political, and will drive this narrative to the point that the politicians we sometimes know that are too weak will get some backbone because they know that we're here, we're not going anywhere. So we need churches. This is a moral movement, a moral fusion movement. We welcome all religions. We welcome all people, even people not of faith. Go to our website, sign up, and help us mobilize for June 20th, 2020, so that during that mobilization, we can not only have a big gathering, but we can have the continuation of a mass movement that will continue to be felt in the halls of Congress, in the communities, in state houses, and at the ballot box.
We have a few people who are wondering about voter issues. John Howarth and Timothy Smith are both asking a similar question. What can we do? And how worried are you about new methods of voter suppression? Wisconsin is an example. And what can we do to make sure that everybody gets their vote?
That's a serious question because, let's be honest, Trump did not win. Trump was in many ways selected president by the continual racist reach of the Electoral College, but also by voter suppression. In the 3 states that took him over, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, he won by something like, they claimed 30,000 votes in Wisconsin, but 250,000 votes were suppressed. Michigan, 10,000 votes, but we know 100,000 African Americans in Detroit alone didn't vote, and similarly in Pennsylvania. And then down through the South, we know that voter suppression has been a major problem, and it's been a big problem ever since 2010, even before Trump was in office. 2010, we saw 26 states since 2010 have passed racist voter suppression laws. And now in the midst of this pandemic, we have additional problems because some people are going to have to, if we don't have mail-in, we'll have to risk their lives to vote. That's another reason why these candidates got to be bold. They got to give people some reason to put on a mask and go stand in the line other than just, I'm nice. I mean, really, they have to hear that, because here's the other side. One of the things that also caused Trump to win was 100 million people didn't vote. And when we did our analysis, we found out that a great number of that 100 million are poor and low wealth people that aren't ever talked to. They just don't vote. We found that when we've gone in the mountains of Appalachia, some of them say nobody really cares about us. We know for instance, in this country, that the margin of poor and low income people who are eligible to vote, who didn't vote, actually represent the margin of transformation. And we know that people under $50,000 a year, make under $50,000 a year, did not vote for Trump. That's a lie when people put this on poor white people. Most of them did not vote for Trump. Many didn't vote, and then those that did voted in a different way. So what must we do? We must mobilize everybody we can to vote. We can't have a democracy where 100 million people stay home and don't participate who can. We must push hard, and every person that's in power to get mail-in ballots. We must push hard. We must push hard to get the $2 billion right now that's necessary to protect our voting democracy. Now, they've only put $400 million in the last few bills. This is another one of those things that I'm saying Democrats ought to fight in public about, not in a back room where nobody sees it. They ought to fight in public about it and make McConnell have to vote against it in the public space, the money that we need to protect this democracy. And we need to be using every avenue we have to say to people, you cannot sit out. You cannot sit out. You cannot sit out. That has to be our mantra, because 100 million people sitting out on top of voter suppression, on top of the attempts to keep us from the polls, is nothing but a formula for continuing to have authoritarian rule in the Senate and the White House.
Reverend Barber, I just want to let you know that in our comments, there are so many people who are so grateful that you're here today, and they're so grateful to hear your words and share this moment with you. I wonder if you could explain your June event a little bit, and how does I believe it's a virtual event. How does that have power? How are you going to help that resonate?
Right. The June 2020 mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March in Washington was going to be a physical event. We've been organizing now for 3 years all over the country. We were on a tour called We Must Do More, mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating people for the movement who vote. And one of the things our organizing tells us, and moving around this country tells us, is three things have to happen if we really want to see transformation in this country. And this pandemic has made it even more of a necessity. Number one, we've got to put a face on poverty. We got to put a face on the hurt that's caused by systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, a war economy, because too often the faces are not seen. As I said, 700 people were dying a day prior to this pandemic. 7 people died from vaping, and it was a national emergency. White House hearings, congressional hearings, 700 people dying a day from poverty and low income, no hearings. We must put a face on poverty. Second thing, we must build power. So every state, every one of our coordinating committees is connecting 30,000 people to the 43 coordinating committees. That'll be over 1 million people that will be connected to this movement, will be connected to push registering people for the movement who vote, will be connected to building power that can challenge at the state level, because so many problems that we face happen at the state level. And the third thing, this is not a march, it's a Poor People's Assembly, because it will be a generationally transformative event that will send people forth with clear steps and actions to move in after June 20th. We had planned for it physically. They shut that down early in DC. They said no big gatherings, and we know we couldn't have that now. But we need, this event is a massive national call. We're getting calls from people around the world who are saying they're going to join that day. We have over 100 and some organizations now, 43 state coordinating committees, 16 denominations. That didn't happen in the former Poor People's March in 1968. This is a moment where people can come together and see this nation and hear the tears and hear the hurt, but not just the hurt. The people who are experiencing this pain, they're also going to put an agenda on the table. We're not inviting people just to march and be mad. We're saying let's mobilize around this agenda and let's build the kind of power that can't be ignored, anymore. One of our songs is somebody's hurting our people and it's gone on far too long and we won't be silent anymore. Another thing we're going to be lifting up is that everybody has a right to live. If we don't, then nobody does. And what I mean by that is, if poor people aren't living in a pandemic, if they're dying, the rest of the nation's gonna die. Because if you don't close the wounds and close the gaps, then everybody is susceptible to being infected. And so this gathering is every era of history required some major gathering that finally sounded the alarm. Whether it was the abolition marches, whether it was the bonus marches in the 1920s, whether it was the march against lynching, whether it was the civil rights movement, whether it was the peace marches and gaps, because they weren't just marches. And that's why this is a poor people's assembly. Lastly, I would say to the folk online, think about it. When is the last time you've seen in the media, except for at the nation, when have you seen in the media poor and impacted people of every race, creed, and color laying out their conditions and having the demands for an agenda? When have you seen politicians have to look in the face of people who are dying without health care and tell them, well, we're going to go back and work out a good compromise, but you might be left out? This is a time for radical realization. And the first thing that we must undermine in this nation is attention violence. The attention violence, the refusal for this nation to truly look at and see and do policies from what's real. Because too often, even our political leaders are inside the walls, and they do so much inside the walls. And inside the walls, I know I'm being a little long, but inside the walls will make you compromise on something and feel like you've done a lot because you are not looking at the people who your compromise leaves out. And we've had 4 bills and hundreds of millions of Americans have been left out. They've been left out, where those people are saying, you might have left us out, but you're gonna have to see us now. On that day, we will have we're having some sophisticated social media that's going to tap into every legislator, every congressperson's, every governor's, every senator's email and Twitter. We're going to have a way. We're working on a way to track, see if they're. We say, come hear your people. We don't want you to come talk. We want you to come listen and hear. And we're sounding this alarm from June 20th forward. It's on. You know, the 21st of June is the beginning of summer, when the sun. The light is the brightest on the earth. We're saying after June 20th, the light on poverty and racism and ecological devastation is the brightest. And we're not an organization, lastly, we're an organism. We're saying to all of our friends, look, we have our silos, but there comes a time when everybody ought to come together, not for William Barber to be the leader or Liz Theo-Harris to be the leader, but there comes a time that we have to say the same people that are against fixing the environment are the same people against public education, are the same people against health care, are the same people against living wage, are the same people that are pro-voter suppression. And if they are cynical enough to be together, we have to be smart enough to come together and build force together. And that's what the 20th is going to be all about.
Thank you. And you should talk as long as you want. I think everybody's hanging on your words. I know I am.
So go to the website. You know, normally I would have on a clergy collar and all, but when I'm gonna put my collar around this T-shirt from now on. It's movement time.
Yeah.
Well, and then to that, we have 2 questions about our leadership going forward. And so, how can the organization that Bernie Sanders put together, the movement he's put together, be most effective in fighting for the issues that you're bringing forward? And then related to that, what can we expect from Joe Biden, and how do we push him?
Yeah, well, here's what we say in the Poor People's Campaign. By the way we're organized, 2 501c3 groups, we didn't endorse, but we were very political. So we talked to every campaign. You know, we talked to the Bernie's campaign, Biden's campaign, and what people need to say now is, I think Bernie said something the other day, not being engaged right now would be irresponsible in this moment. That is not to say any one candidate has everything that we think, but we do know something about the current presidential candidate and the current leadership of the Senate. We need to stop just saying president too. We need to connect the two because it's not just a presidential election. We're going to elect every member of the United States House of Representatives and a third or more, or maybe 2/3 of the United States Senate, and the person who is currently the leader of the Senate. We're going to be electing governors and so forth and so on. Here's what we believe when we take an honest look at history. In 1965, we forget that it was not an election year. The Voting Rights Act was not won in an election year. The Voting Rights Act was won in a non-election year when you had a president sitting in the presidency who had been a segregationist, even though he was a Democrat, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The movement decided that they would elect to change the political landscape and force politicians who, before they began the movement, were being practical. The movement decided, we're gonna make you a great president. We're gonna push the United States Senate and Congress to do what they otherwise would not do if there was not what we call positive and creative tension. The best thing we can do in this moment, we know what we have to do in terms of who's some folk that need to get home. But I said to Vice President Biden the other day on a podcast, I was on Eastern, and I said, you know, Brother Vice President, there are things you said a few months ago that may not work now. Your thinking needs to shift if you become the person running, and this is the moment that it can happen. The pandemic has shifted everything. I said, this is like a Great Depression moment. Mm-hmm. A lot of things Franklin Roosevelt did not intend to do. In fact, one time he told one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, he said, go out and make me do it. And I said to him, a month ago, we were talking about we couldn't afford healthcare. Well, that's been shot to hell now because we found $2.5 trillion overnight. So we have to decide in the movement now. Number one, what we're not going to take that already exists. And then we have to have a movement that pushes people to be better than they ever imagined. Better than they ever imagined. Right? And we show our power for both at the ballot box, before the ballot box, and after the ballot box. That's why we're not backing up on this agenda. That's why we have this gathering on the 20th of June, and whenever they have the conventions, whether it be by digital or whatever, they're going to have to respond to these thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. And we're saying, you don't have to tell people who to vote for. Vote for you. What you do is work for them. They'll know who to vote for. If people understand, if they put you in, they're going to get health care, you don't have to worry about people voting, not now. If people understand that they're going to get living wages, you don't have to worry, they will vote. So what we have to do is not back up on our agenda, not back up on our agitation, not back up on bringing awareness to this nation of what's at stake, and make these people who are running for office see us, hear us, feel us, and know that this is bad English, but it's good movement. Us ain't going nowhere.
Gloria Davis, she's an educator. She teaches the sociology of race and gender. And building on what you're talking about, what she's wondering is, how does she get her students more involved in the fight for racial justice and equality, so that they become part of the solution? She points out that her white students certainly understand or are aware of, I should say, racism and sexism and classism. But how does she, what tools should she be using to bring them deeper into this fight?
Yeah, I'm going to sound somewhat like a broken record, but let me say this: the young people, in many ways, get it. I never forget when we were in the backwoods of Kentucky, in Harlan County, Kentucky, and people said, "Don't go back there." They said, "If you go back there, 89% of the people back there voted for Trump." And what I found out is 89% of the people who voted may have voted for Trump, but it wasn't 89% of the people. There were a lot of people that just didn't vote. And a lot of people that used to vote Democrat, but what they told me, they said the last time Democrats came back here was when Lyndon Baines Johnson announced the war on poverty in Harlan County, Kentucky. And since then, we just feel abandoned. And a lot of people are voting out of hurt and pain. But what got me that day was the large contingency of young people that were in that room back up in the mountains. And everywhere we go, the large numbers. So now what we've done in this campaign, we've commissioned a whole group of young fellows, young people who are doing deep dive understanding, deep dive organizing. And we have two powerful leaders, Dr. Cohen and Reverend Erica Williams. And if those young folk go to our website, poorpeoplescampaign.org or www.breachrepair.org, they can click on how to get in touch with that portion of the work. But here's one difference. We're not separating the work out. So for instance, we did a training at Howard University, and it was the elders and the youth together. One thing we push moral analysis. That's where you use your deepest religious values and your deepest constitutional values as a grid by which you examine all public policy. And if that policy doesn't bring the establishment of justice and promoting the general welfare, then we say that it's constitutionally inconsistent, morally indefensible, and economically insane. If it doesn't line up with caring for the least of these, the poor and the immigrants, then it's theologically unjustified. But the other thing we do is we believe in moral organizing, moral fusion organizing. And we build this from actually the 1865, 66, 67, 68 in American history, when Black and white people, poor people, particularly post the Civil War, found a way to come together and reshape the political landscape. So we are very sensitive to division. You know, for instance, I don't go to any meetings that are just Black meetings anymore, or white meetings, or just Southern meetings, or just male meetings. That's not moral fusion organizing. So we teach that we don't have a young arm that's kind of over here, and then there's an older arm. And what we need is fusion, because extremists and authoritarians exploit our divisions. They always have. They bet on them. Right now, every extremist that's in office from the South, the thing they fear the most is a few people finding that they ought to be together. Because most of them are not winning by large numbers. You know, they're not winning like they used to by the 20 and 30%. Some of them just winning by 1%, and they are afraid. That's why they do so much to divide us. So we need those young people to come involved in this movement, but recognize when they come in, yes, it'll be with other young people, but we do not see young people as the leaders of tomorrow. We see them as a critical, necessary part of the leadership right now. That's why every stat that we do in the Poor People's Campaign, we disaggregate it. We disaggregate it by race, we disaggregate it by age, we disaggregate it by geography, because we want people to understand we're talking about you. We're talking about you.
That's very powerful. Thank you. We're almost out of time, and I would just, if I can, I would just like to ask two more questions from our audience. Gloria Loventhal wonders, how do all of us deal with the anger and frustration that comes out of the inequality and injustice and comes out of this moment that you're talking about?
You know, I'm dealing with it, but not alone. And I was, and many of us in this campaign were hurt. I'm struggling with the word anger because we're working with the Apache people now who are facing the destruction of their lands in Arizona. And they have said to us, they don't have a word for anger in the Apache language because they too often associate anger with losing your mind or doing something evil. Now, I don't necessarily go that far, but I'm trying to hear what they're saying. And they do have a pretty language for frustrating, being hurt deeply in the soul. They have all kinds of language around that. In my own faith tradition, it says something about being angry, but sin not. And there it means be angry, but don't use the tools of that which has made you angry, lest you become what you fight against. And so in some ways, for me, there are three disciplines. You've heard me a lot in the nation talk about history and the ugly sides of history and the American psychosis. But I will never talk about those ugly sides without saying, but there's always been another side of the history. Mm-hmm. There's always been another side. There was this, yes, there was the genocide, but then there was another side of people who stood against it. Yes, there was slavery, but there was another side where Black and white people like Frederick Douglass and like William Lloyd Garrison and others came together. Yes, there was the ugly monopolies of the turn of the 20th century and industry oppression, but then there was the social gospel movement. Yes, there was lynching. Then there was the civil rights movement that began with white people leading the NAACP. Yes. So in every moment of history, there's been the rise up of wrong and oppression, but there's been something else that has brought up another standard. And so what keeps me and many of us in this moment is that every generation has its Edmund Pettus Bridge. Every generation has its civil rights movement. Every generation has its Middle Passage. Every generation has its Jericho Wall. Every generation has its Red Sea. Every generation has its Calvary. And the question is, what do you do when you've been chosen to be the antithesis to those things? Do you remain frustrated, or do you become more faithful for the gratefulness of, number one, not being on the side of that wrong and having the sense enough to get up every morning knowing that you're not on that side and knowing that you have to use those last breaths that you have. If you only had 48 hours left before you're on a ventilator, what would you use those last breaths for? What kind of world, what kind of grace, what kind of mercy? The second thing that keeps me is to looking at the people every day who've been facing this pandemic of poverty and lives, and they've not given up. The greatest hope that I get is when we go into the Delta, when we go into Appalachia, when we go I was in San Francisco among the homeless, and I got out of the car, and one of the guys said, "Hey, Reverend Barber, we're organizing." And he was on the street. He said, "We got to fight back." And this is a brother living on the street. I don't even know who he was. We took time to talk. But he had not lost hope. He had not given up. She doesn't give up. I've met with coal miners who are dying from black lung, who are saying, until I go die, I'm organizing with this movement. So how can we give up when they have not? And then finally, I just don't believe that evil has the last word. I just do not believe it. I just do not believe it. And I believe something the Pope said the other day. He said this. He was praying and he said, maybe this moment is not a moment of God's judgment on us, but a moment when God is calling us to make a judgment. When God is calling us to decide to seize this time of trial as a time of choosing what kind of world, what kind of community will we settle for. And so for me, as a person of faith, I just came through Easter. Most people run to Easter, but they don't know Easter's good news doesn't begin with resurrection. It begins with crucifixion. It began when the witnesses of the crucifixion don't give up. They keep looking for the resurrection. They keep looking for the possibility, and they find it. The good news is that those who, even if it means being crucified, they will not succumb to the oppressive forces of this world. It is somebody believing so much in what's right that if it means dying as a revolutionary for love and truth and justice, they would rather die like that than live apathetic and live without any concern. And when folk get that kind of determination, it always leads to some form of resurrection, to some form of transformation. It always leads to a moment where the valley of dry bones, people who've been pushed down, end up getting up. And so let me close with this prayer, and then that we're praying, because how we part of the work of staying focused is praying for our tradition, and it says this: may we come to know justice and compassion and repent for those who have let the viruses of greed and lies make the situation worse. May we come to know pandemic spread through the wounds and the fissures of society and seek to close them. May those who've gone along with the lies just to please narcissism break free and tell the truth. May we who are merely inconvenienced remember those whose lives are at stake. May we who have no risk factors remember those most vulnerable. May we have the necessary righteous indignation in this moment to fight for transformation. May we who have the luxury of working from home remember those who must choose between preserving their health or making their rent. May we who have the flexibility to care for our children when their schools are closed remember those who have no option. May we who have to cancel our trips remember those who have no safe place to go. May we who are losing our margin money in the turmoil of the economic market remember those who have no margins at all. May we who settle in for a quarantine at home remember those who have no home. As fear grips our country, may we be the kind of people who stand up and who refuse to lay down. May we choose love. During this time when we cannot physically wrap our arms around each other, let us yet find ways to be the loving embrace of God for our neighbors, and let us recognize that we cannot give up in this moment. And no matter what it takes, let at least be written down in history that with our last breaths, we fought for the world that ought to be.
Reverend, I think people on this call could stay here for the rest of the day, for many days, listening to you. Thank you for the power, the passion, the urgency of your words and your deeds. I guarantee you that everyone on this call is going to be joining on June 20th for the struggle to realize a new America, a different set of values. You remind us of the struggle. You remind us of why we need to fight. You remind us why we need to stay engaged. And you do it with such humanity. And we're so grateful. I wanted to say that the nation covered the Poor People's Campaign in '68. We will be there shoulder to shoulder, covering digitally the march. And for those on the call, the Reverend spoke so eloquently about history and the underside and overside of history. And the nation has been there at different times, as the Reverend knows, through Reconstruction and its counter, and today, third Reconstruction. So Reverend, we're so grateful to you. With humility, I have a proposal. I wish you would consider a 15-minute briefing every day as an antidote and a counter to what we hear. You would give people solace, hope, and engagement, and reason for the struggle which must go on to make America what it can be, what it could be. And I want to thank those on the call for supporting the nation. I hope you'll continue support in these times when we try to lift up as best we can, ideas to transform, as the Reverend spoke of, to bring attention to those who have seen pandemics of poverty before, and to try and think how to reimagine and rethink and realize a revolution of values in this country. So thank you so much. We have Representative Jamie Raskin, who I think the Reverend knows. We have Bill McKibben, Zephyr Teachout, Ai-jen Poo coming for these great conversations with people, of course, of humane wisdom needed so much in these times. Thank you, Reverend.
Thank you. And I will consider, well, let's talk about that with some,
I think
with some epidemiologists.
Be very powerful.
All right.
All right.
God bless you. Thank you all.